The poor waitress accidentally spilled wine on a billion-dollar contract. The millionaire roared in the middle of the ballroom, "You uneducated trash!" But the 3 words she uttered next left the entire room silent and his reputation in ruins in an instant. Can you guess what those 3 words were? Try commenting with your prediction, because this comeback will keep you glued to the screen until the very last second. For Elena, the Per Se restaurant was a parallel universe, a place where she could temporarily forget her past and live under an ordinary name. Here, she didn't have to prove anything. Everything was measured by a glass of wine poured to the right proportion, a dish set down without a sound. The precision offered her a sense of safety that the financial world had once stripped away. This job wasn't a dream. It was a way to survive. The rent money would only last for 2 more weeks. Job applications she'd sent out went unanswered. Former colleagues avoided her gaze, as if afraid of being implicated. So she accepted standing here, in a simple uniform, bowing her head to serve people who were once like her. Cold, calculating, and believing the world revolved around profit margins. Tonight, table 12 was the center of every eye. Ethan Grant, the man sitting there, needed no introduction. The way he leaned back in his chair, speaking softly yet silencing the entire table, was enough to show his power. His dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a closed-door meeting of people deciding the fate of hundreds of others elsewhere. Elena poured the wine, quietly moving past. She overheard a few words. Takeover, liquidation, maximize profits. The words felt like cold metal fragments touching a wound that hadn't healed. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to continue. Just getting through this evening shift would net her $300, enough to pay the electricity and water bills. She held the bottle of Chateau Margaux, approaching their table. Ethan and his partner were hunched over the contract. A draft from the air conditioner gently flipped an appendix sheet, sending it to the floor, where it landed right beside her feet. She bent down to pick it up, a natural act for a server, but as she placed the paper back, her eyes paused for a moment. The bold title jumped out at her. Appendix, Asset Liquidation, Vance Manufacturing. Time seemed to stop. That name, Vance, wasn't just a company. It was her father's name. It was a legacy, a childhood. Everything that had crumbled before her eyes a year ago, when Grant Capital acquired and completely dismantled it. Her breath hitched. The words on the page blurred through suppressed tears. 80% staff reduction. Resale of production line. Every sound in the room seemed muffled. She stood frozen, the wine bottle still in her hand, her eyes fixed on the paper, where her father's signature lay on an old agreement, and now, nestled among emotionless numbers. Ethan Grant looked up. "You only deserve to wipe my feet." The words fell like a knife blade. Snickers rose from the back rows. A few he caught her gaze, the gaze of a waitress, staring at confidential documents. Annoyance surged. He felt invaded, challenged, and with an arrogant instinct, he chose humiliation instead of inquiry. He gave a slight, cold smile. "Can you read any of that? Or are you just trying to spell out the long words?" His voice was loud enough for a few surrounding tables to hear. Several heads turned. Elena flinched. She looked up, her eyes empty. Her hand trembled slightly. The wine bottle tilted. A drop of rich red wine spilled out, landing exactly on that page, spreading into a crimson stain right next to her father's signature. The red stain spread slowly, like a drop of blood on a murdered legacy. Ethan slammed his hand down on the table. Porters raised their cameras. Flashlights fired continuously, illuminating every droplet of water clinging to her face. Elena stood still. Her wet hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were fixed straight ahead, not flinching. She spoke, slowly, every word clear, like an oath carved in stone. How ironic that the hands that once pulled you from death are now being used by you to be stepped on. The sound in the hall suddenly vanished. No one reacted in time. Then, people turned to look at each other, murmurs spreading like a cold wind. Another server dropped a tray of glasses, the sound of breaking glass making the entire room shudder. Leonardo paused slightly. Unbelievable. He jumped up, his voice sharp, his face red. Not only nosy, but destructive. I told you, you can't expect manners from people who can't even get a degree. The sentence was like a cold knife. The whole room fell silent. Only the faint, mournful, almost cruel sound of the piano remained. Elena did not bow her head to apologize. She didn't cry. She just stood still, her eyes like calm water after a storm. She spoke slowly, her voice soft, yet echoing to every corner of the room. Harvard. A flash of surprise crossed Ethan's eyes. Economics. The air thickened. He took a step back, his fingers still trembling on the table. Summa cum laude. The three words fell like hammer blows on cold metal, resonating in the silent room. A wine glass at a nearby table slipped from someone's hand, shattering on the floor. The sound seemed to stretch into eternity. Ethan stood rigid, his eyes fixed on her, then looking down at the red wine stain spreading over the name Vance Manufacturing. Fragments of memory flashed in his mind. The acquisition, the numbers, the urgent letter from a father begging to save the factory. It all converged, and he understood. This girl wasn't just a staff member. She was the sole heir of the company he had dismantled. He felt something alien, a sense of unease, an emotion he had forgotten for years. Elena said nothing more. She placed the wine bottle on the table, gave a slight nod, and turned away. Her every step was barely audible, but to Ethan, the sound was like a judgment. When the door closed, he slumped back into his chair, his eyes still fixed on the paper. The red wine stain was no longer a smudge. It was the wound of a human being, and the accusation of a conscience. The party that evening did not end with a bang, but with an awkward silence. Ethan Grant, the man who was never at a loss for words, suddenly found himself unable to find a conclusion. He stared at the wine glass in front of him. A dark red trace remained at the rim, exactly like the wine stain on the paper that the waitress had left behind. The three words, Harvard, economics, summa cum laude, still echoed in his mind like distant bells, growing clearer with every passing moment. He hadn't watched her leave, but her gaze, calm, not angry, not remorseful, seemed imprinted on his mind. The kind of look Ethan had seen before, in the mirror, many years ago, when he was a young man who believed that intellect could change the world, not just power. That night, he went home early, something that had never happened before. The penthouse was brightly lit, vast, and cold. A half-finished bottle of wine was still on the table. He started to pour a glass, then stopped. For some reason, the hand holding the bottle trembled slightly. He put it down, sitting pensively before the glass window, overlooking the city. Car lights stretched out, brilliant, but he only felt an unnamed void. She's just a waitress, he told himself, almost trying to force himself to believe it. But when he poured his coffee the next morning, he realized his hand was still shaking slightly. In his 52nd floor office, the morning sun streamed through the clear glass, reflecting off the dense financial charts. Ethan tried to read, but the numbers seemed to have lost their usual clarity. He sighed softly, scoffing at himself. Am I, a man like me, obsessed over just a server? Yet, the harder he tried to forget, the clearer the image of the girl became, her serene eyes, her steady voice, and the wine stain like a drop of blood on the name Vance Manufacturing. The office door opened. David, his loyal assistant, walked in, his face maintaining its characteristic composure. "Good morning, sir. It seems last night left a lingering impression." He didn't reply. David placed the tablet on the desk. The headline read, "Millionaire Ethan Grant, silenced by waitress at luxury party." The video was blurry, but the moment was heartbreakingly clear. The girl pouring the wine, the drop falling, his outburst, and then the three words echoing. "How many views?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "Over 2 million, sir." David hesitated. "And your mother called." Ethan looked up, tired. "What did she say?" David lowered his voice. "She just said, 'Ethan, you were taught how to apologize. Perhaps it's time to remember that.'" The room suddenly fell silent. Ethan looked out the window. Below, tiny people hurried past. None of them knew he was sitting here, the wealthy man who had just realized he had nothing left to be proud of. He spoke softly, almost mumbling. "Thank you, Mother. I will remember." But instead of apologizing, Ethan chose another way, to find out. He needed to know why a summa cum laude graduate from Harvard was serving wine at Per Se. It was no longer a matter of honor, but a question that gnawed at him all morning. "David," he said, his voice regaining its old calm. "The girl's name is Elena. I want to know everything about her, education, background, past jobs, everything." David nodded, not asking for a reason. That afternoon, David returned, placing a blue folder on the desk. "Sir, her file is quite unusual." Ethan opened it. First page, Elena Vance, Bachelor of Applied Economics, Harvard University, summa cum laude. He nodded slightly. He knew that. Next page, Sterling and Finch, investment analyst. Rating, excellent. Then abruptly, resignation, reason unknown. Ethan flipped through quickly. No address, no fixed contact information, no credit activity for a whole year. Only a P.O. box and a few small transactions in the name of a local charity fund. David explained. "She has virtually disappeared from the digital world. No social media accounts, no financial records. She deliberately erased her tracks." Ethan frowned. "Running from what?" David was silent. No one knew. When David left, the room fell silent again. Ethan sat there, looking at the paper with the wine stain that was still in yesterday's documents. The name Vance Manufacturing repeated in his head like an echo from a distant abyss. He opened his computer, searching for the name. Only a few brief lines. An old manufacturing company collapsed after being acquired. Nothing remarkable. And then he asked himself, "Why did you tremble when you saw that paper, Elena Vance?" He replayed the video clip, stopping at the moment her eyes rested on the word Vance. No, that wasn't curiosity. That was recognition, a memory, a wound. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The city lights reflected on the desk, forming thousands of shimmering streaks of light. He no longer found them beautiful. They only made him think of the disjointed fragments of a story he didn't understand, but sensed that it could change everything. Who was this girl? And why, in her eyes, did he see a reflection of the conscience he had lost? Days passed, but Elena Vance's image did not leave Ethan's mind. She appeared in the silences between meetings, in the reflection of the elevator door, even in his restless sleep. She was like an unsolvable puzzle, and the more he tried to forget her, the more he remembered. David still sent reports regularly, but they all ended with the same line: "No new data found." Elena was like a small scratch on the perfect wall he had built around himself, not deep, but never healing. The media storm eventually subsided. But its lingering effects, the curious looks, the whispers when he entered a boardroom, remained, persistent. For the first time, Ethan Grant felt he was not entirely in control of his own image. One Wednesday afternoon, after a long, drawn-out meeting, he suddenly didn't want to go home. He didn't want to face the quiet penthouse where only the clock counted time. He told his driver that he would drive himself today. The Bentley rolled through unfamiliar streets. New York City was still noisy, but the only sounds in the car cabin were the steady hum of the engine and the heavy beat of his heart. He stopped at an intersection, red light, and on that street corner, nestled between the cold glass buildings, was a small, warm spot called the Reading Nook, an old bookstore with a dark wooden sign and bright red geraniums on the windowsill. A place where, just by looking through, one could feel a peace that didn't belong to his world. He didn't intend to stop. But then, through the frosted glass, he saw her. Elena, no longer in a waitress uniform, no longer with the hardened look of someone fighting humiliation. Just a woman in a simple cream-colored sweater and jeans, her hair casually draped over her shoulders, smiling at someone. That smile was effortless, unguarded. It was genuine and peaceful. He didn't get out. He just sat still in the car, as if opening the door would make everything vanish. Why a bookstore? He asked himself, a person who had worked at Harvard, Sterling and Finch, now behind a coffee counter. Not failure, but a choice to disappear. A few minutes later, the bookstore door opened. His nanny, Maria, led Leo, his 8-year-old son, inside. Ethan froze. He had forgotten today was Wednesday, the day Leo always came here for story time, a small routine that he himself had never been present for. He lowered his seat, leaning over to look through the window. Inside, Elena was sitting on a low chair, surrounded by children. Her voice was deep, slow and warm, like the voice of mothers telling stories before bedtime, long ago. She wasn't just reading. She seemed to be weaving images with her words. The children sat perfectly still, and Leo, the boy who usually avoided interaction, was shy and retreated into his own world, was sitting closest to her. The boy wasn't looking at the illustrations. He was looking at her face, attentive, as if listening with his whole heart. When Elena paused at the climax, she lowered her voice. And the boy understood that courage wasn't about not being afraid, but about knowing fear and still doing the right thing. The group was silent. Then Leo smiled, a rare, innocent, pure smile that Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his son smile like that. After the reading, the children ran off. Only Leo remained. The boy pointed to the paper cranes hanging from the ceiling. Elena took one down and handed him a blue piece of paper. Want to try folding one? The boy nodded. She sat down on the floor next to him. With each fold, she whispered, "Slowly. No need to be perfect." "Just keep your palms warm." Ethan saw his son's small hand placed in hers, an image that choked him up. He, the father who could buy the best schools, the most expensive toys, had never known how to hold his son's hand like that. The light in the bookstore was a soft yellow. The sound of rain outside began to patter on the car roof. Inside, Eleanor laughed when Leo made a wrong fold, then gently corrected it. The boy giggled, this time a real unforced laugh. Ethan felt his vision blur. He wasn't sure if it was because of the mist or because something had dissolved in his chest. When the lesson ended, Leo held up the paper crane and whispered something that made Elena burst into laughter. She leaned down, said goodbye, and the boy ran towards the door, his hand still clutching the gift. Ethan saw his son look up, his eyes radiant. The look he had dreamed of seeing, but never received. He wanted to step in, to say something. Thank you, or "I'm sorry," but his throat was dry. A man like him, used to giving orders, used to being listened to, now didn't know how to speak to an ordinary woman. He restarted the car. The engine roared and then died. He tried again. Still nothing. Ethan sat silently, his hands on the steering wheel. Through the window, he saw Eleanor tidying the counter, and Leo, his son, was still turning back to wave, his radiant smile shining through the thin curtain of rain. He didn't start the engine again. He just sat there, in silence, listening to the rain. And for the first time in years, Ethan Grant was afraid to return to his own silence. The days following the chance encounter with Elena at the bookstore, Ethan Grant seemed changed. No one said it, but the whole office could feel it. The once confident, cold CEO now carried an invisible crack. He tried to bury his worries under mountains of work, under tense meetings and reports, hundreds of pages long. But the harder he tried, the more he failed. Some nights he sat alone in his office, the light from the screen reflecting on his tired face. He looked out the window, where the city still glowed like a giant circuit board, and quietly asked, "How can she be so calm, after everything I've done?" He wanted to regain his familiar sense of control, but everything seemed to be working against him. In the boardroom, when council members debated a controversial investment project, Ethan wasn't listening anymore. A director quietly said, "The moral hazard is too great. The media won't ignore it." Ethan continued looking at the documents in front of him, then softly said, his voice cold and weary, "Risk is part of the game." Seeing everyone still hesitant, he slammed his hand on the table. "Sign it." No more discussion. The air thickened. No one objected, but in their eyes was a mix of fear and pity. That evening, the rain began to fall. Ethan left the office late, refusing his driver, wanting to drive himself, as he always did when he needed to think. The Bentley sped through the heavy rain. Yellow lights streaked across the windshield, and the wiper's steady sweep matched his erratic heartbeat. In the rearview mirror, his face was pale, his eyes deep. Gone was the image of the man who once believed he held everything in his hands, replaced by someone running from himself. He turned on the radio, then immediately turned it off. The sound of the rain replaced everything. For a moment, Ethan suddenly laughed, a dry, hollow sound echoing in the confined space. "I won the world, but I lost myself, didn't I?" As soon as the words left his mouth, a sharp pain shot through his chest. It wasn't violent, just like an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. He tried to breathe, but his breath was choppy. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His hands cramped, the steering wheel tilted. The car swerved right, gradually leaning toward the side of the road. Headlights flashed in distorted streaks through the rain, then went out. There was no loud crash, just a long tilt, a breath cut short, and then silence. The heavy, frantic sound of rain on the car body was the only remaining sound. Ethan slumped over the steering wheel, his breath weak. In a half-conscious, half-dream state, he saw disjointed images flashing in his mind. His mother, smiling gently, cutting an apple pie, her familiar voice echoing, "Ethan, you can have everything, but never lose your kindness." He used to consider that the saying of a dreamer. Now, it sounded like a farewell. He saw his son, Leo, smiling brightly, holding up the blue paper crane. He saw Eleanor, her eyes that night at the restaurant, not hateful, not fearful, only deep sorrow. What did she see in me that I couldn't? The question was lost in the void, drifting in the thick darkness. He felt himself giving up, a cold sensation spreading, and everything faded away. In the midst of the silence, a sound broke through. Not the rain, not the wind. It was a voice, urgent, yet firm. "Hey, can you hear me?" Then came the sound of breaking glass, the wind rushing into the car cabin, cold, but also making him breathe again. Ethan felt hands pulling him out of the driver's seat. Small, soaking wet, but strong hands. She didn't think, didn't deliberate, she just acted. The hands that once trembled with anger now trembled for fear of losing a life before her eyes. Elena pulled him through the narrow doorframe. Her clothes soaked, her hair matted down by the rain. The wind whipped her face, the rain hammered her skin. But she didn't stop. Another car stopped. Someone called an ambulance, but she heard nothing. She only looked at the pale face struggling to breathe in front of her, and in that moment, all resentment vanished. "Hold on, Ethan," she said, in gasps. "Don't go, not this way." Her voice broke, mixing with the rain, turning into a desperate plea. Ambulance lights swept across the road, reflecting on her rain-drenched face. Ethan opened his eyes. Everything was blurred, but he saw her clearly, the woman he had once scorned, now leaning close to him, her eyes full of worry. He couldn't speak. All his remaining strength focused on a single movement. His hand trembled, reaching out, searching for hers. That hand, which had once shakily held a wine tray under the lights of a luxurious restaurant, now became the only thread holding him to life. The rain continued to fall, cold and heavy. Elena leaned down, clasping his hand tightly. She didn't know why she had stopped her car at that exact moment, didn't know why her heart had ceased its anger. She only knew that, between the rainy night and the wailing ambulance sirens, she felt something changing. In him, and in herself. The first sensation when Ethan woke up was a dull ache in his chest, as if a heavy object was pressing down. The smell of disinfectant stung his nose, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor echoed in his ear. He was in a private hospital room, all white and sterile. The last thing he remembered was lying on the cold sidewalk, looking up at a face drenched in rain through flickering lights. His hand was still slightly cramped, as if still trying to hold on to something. The room door softly opened. An elderly doctor walked in, examining the chart in his hand. "Good morning, Mr. Grant. You gave us quite a scare," the doctor said, his tone calm. "An acute heart attack. You were very lucky. If the passerby hadn't pulled you out of the car in time and administered proper first aid, we might not be having this conversation." "The passerby," Ethan whispered, his throat dry. The image flashed back. Elena. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his chest forced him to lie back down. "She... where is she?" The doctor shrugged. "She left after ensuring you were safe. Didn't leave a name, just said she was a passerby. A true silent hero. After the doctor left, David, his assistant, walked in, a rare look of worry on his face. Thank goodness you're okay. The whole office was in a panic. David, Ethan interrupted, his voice still weak. Find her for me. Elena Vance. She works at the Reading Nook bookstore. Go there, see if she's there. David nodded and quickly left. Ethan lay there, looking up at the white ceiling. He, a millionaire who could manipulate the market, had to lie here helpless, his life saved by the woman he had treated the worst. The irony was more painful than the ache in his chest. A while later, David returned. "Sir, she's here." "Here?" Ethan was surprised. "Yes, sitting in the waiting area outside the hallway. It seems she wanted to make sure you were out of danger." Before leaving, Ethan took a deep breath. Help me get out there." Despite David's protests, Ethan leaned on the IV stand, slowly walking out of the room, and he saw her. Eleanor was sitting on a blue plastic chair at the end of the hallway, quietly reading a paperback book, as calm as if she were in a park, not a hospital. Her hair was still slightly damp, and there was a small scratch on her cheek that she probably didn't notice. She looked up when she saw him. She didn't appear surprised or worried, simply closed the book. Ethan slowly walked toward her, every step an effort. He stood before her, a powerful man who now looked vulnerable in a patient gown. He searched his mind for flowery words of thanks, promises of reward, but they all sounded hollow. He could only ask one single question, the one that had tormented him since he woke up. Why? His voice was hoarse. After everything I did, why save me? Eleanor looked straight into his eyes. Her gaze held no pity nor forgiveness. It held only a raw truth. I didn't save you because you deserved it, she replied, her tone calm. I saved you because I could. The answer stunned Ethan into silence. It wasn't an accusation, nor an act of self-righteousness. It was simply a statement about her nature, a person who would do the right thing, regardless of the circumstances. It made him feel smaller and more ashamed than any insult could have. He couldn't find a word in response. The next day, the press reported heavily on the accident of financial mogul Ethan Grant. They praised the silent hero who saved his life, speculating on all possible scenarios. But no one knew who it was. A few days later, when he was feeling better, Ethan secretly had David deliver a large bouquet of white lilies and a thick envelope to the bookstore. Inside the envelope was a check with enough money for her never to have to work again, along with a clumsily handwritten card. Thank you for saving my life. That afternoon, a delivery person brought the bouquet and envelope back to the hospital. The envelope was still sealed, unopened. Accompanying it was a small note from the bookstore's notepad, with Elena's handwriting, I don't need your reward. Ethan held the unopened envelope. He walked over to the hospital room window. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight were illuminating the city. He looked down at the bustling crowd below, but for the first time, he didn't feel he was standing at the top of the world. He felt he was just a small part of it. His eyes were heavy with a new emotion, an emotion he had rarely felt in his life. It was gratitude. A pure gratitude, unrelated to power or money, for the woman who had rejected everything he could offer. The unopened envelope lay on the table beside Ethan's hospital bed as a silent reminder of his failure. He, the man who could buy everything, could not buy even a simple acknowledgement. Elena's refusal was more powerful than any accusation. It forced him to look in the mirror and face the man he had become, a man who believed everything could be solved with a check. After a few days, he was discharged. The bruise on his chest still hurt, but that wasn't the wound that bothered him the most. Returning to the empty mansion, he felt a deep loneliness. The first thing he did was go to his son's room. Leo, the 8-year-old boy, was sitting on the floor, surrounded by Lego blocks. When he saw his father enter, the boy looked up, his eyes showing worry. He had been told his father had an accident, but didn't fully grasp its severity. Ethan sat down on the floor, an action he rarely took before. He didn't say anything, just silently watched his son. Leo shyly pushed a Lego car toward him. I built it for you, Dad, the boy whispered. It was a simple moment, but it touched a deep place within Ethan. He realized he had almost lost these moments. He hugged his son tightly, a hug that was perhaps the most genuine one in years. A few weeks later, in an effort to reconnect with his son and also to improve his public image, Ethan agreed to attend a charity fair held at a local park. He usually just sent a check, but this time he decided to attend in person with Leo. The fair was noisy and bustling, full of game booths and food stalls. Leo, initially timid, was quickly drawn to a small booth in the corner of the park. There, a group of volunteers was teaching children how to fold origami paper, and the person in charge of that booth was none other than Elena. Ethan froze. She was wearing a simple white t-shirt, her hair in a ponytail, and patiently showing a little girl how to fold a butterfly. She looked comfortable and peaceful amidst the chaos. Leo, unaware of his father's hesitation, ran straight to the booth. "Miss Eleanor." Eleanor looked up, and a warm smile appeared on her lips when she saw Leo. "Hello, little explorer. What are we going to fold today?" Ethan walked over, feeling incredibly awkward. He stood behind his son, unsure of what to say or do. Elena glanced at him, a slight nod replacing a greeting. There was no awkwardness, no reminder of what had passed. She treated him like any other ordinary parent. He stood there, watching his son happily sit down next to Elena. The boy, usually quiet, now chattered excitedly to her about school, about his Lego car. She listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, which made the boy even more enthusiastic. He saw his son laugh, a radiant, carefree smile. Ethan had never seen his son open up to anyone like this. He began to feel the warmth radiating from this woman, a genuine warmth that he had lost long ago in his calculating world. After finishing a paper boat, Leo turned to his father, his eyes sparkling. "Dad," the boy pleaded, "can you invite Miss Elena to get ice cream with us?" "I want to thank her." Leo's innocent suggestion hung in the air. Ethan stiffened, unsure how to react. He looked at Elena, waiting for a direct refusal. But this time, Elena didn't immediately refuse. She looked at Leo, then at Ethan. Their eyes met for a moment, brief, silent, yet filled with many unsaid things. In Ethan's eyes was remorse and a silent plea. In her eyes, he wasn't sure what he saw. Perhaps a little hesitation, a little curiosity. She smiled at Leo. "All right," she said softly. "I suppose one ice cream cone is fine." Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, a feeling he hadn't realized he was holding. As they walked together toward the ice cream stand, Leo happily walked between them, not holding either hand, but his presence had inadvertently created a fragile connection. Elena and Ethan's eyes met again, over Leo's head. This time, it lasted a little longer. It was no longer confrontation, nor entirely forgiveness. It was something new beginning to form. A quiet start, built on gratitude and an unresolved past. The ice cream melted under the park's afternoon sun, but the tension between Ethan and Elena had eased somewhat. Their conversation was still hesitant, led primarily by Leo's innocent questions. The boy became the fragile bridge, allowing the two adults to sit together without feeling awkward. They sat on a wooden bench overlooking the lake, which shimmered in the late afternoon sun. A light breeze blew through, rustling the water and the few remaining yellow leaves on the branches. Leo was tired, his head resting on Elena's shoulder, his breathing even. That innocent trust made Ethan's heart sink, a warmth mixed with a sharp ache that he hadn't felt in a very long time. In that silence, Ethan finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had haunted him for so long. "Miss Vance, Elena," he called softly, his voice low and deep. "I still don't understand. Harvard, Sterling and Finch. Why did you give it all up?" Eleanor didn't look at him. Her eyes were directed at the lake, reflecting the golden sunlight, as if looking into a distant place in her memory. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice slow, not resentful, but containing profound sadness. "I used to believe in that world," she said. "I believed in the numbers, in market rules. I believed that if you worked hard and honestly, you would be rewarded. My father believed that too. He spent his entire life building Vance Manufacturing, not to become an empire, but to create jobs, so that every product was made with pride. She paused for a moment, her voice catching. But then one day, that world stopped being logical. A larger, stronger investment fund targeted his company. They didn't see people, only numbers. They called it asset optimization. I called it robbery. Ethan stirred slightly but said nothing. His heart pounded. This story, he had heard it somewhere in a meeting, a report, among the emotionless figures he had once signed off on. My father fought, Elena continued. He sold the old house, mortgaged everything to save the factory. I also used everything I knew, every connection, every number. But we were just a small fish in an ocean of predators. And then, the outcome was what everyone predicted. The company went bankrupt. Workers lost their jobs and he... Her voice trembled slightly. He couldn't endure the shock. He passed away 2 weeks later. A gentle breeze blew past. Ethan bowed his head. No one spoke. The lake still rippled, but it seemed even nature was holding its breath. After the funeral, Elena whispered, I cleaned out his office. I found a letter he wrote to the head of the investment fund that acquired the company. In the letter, he didn't blame them. He only asked them to keep the production running for the workers who had spent their lives there. A final plea, Ethan closed his eyes, feeling a heavy weight in his chest. That letter, Eleanor continued, was sent to Mark Lawson, the executive vice president at Grant Capital. But my father knew the person who signed the final decision wasn't Lawson. It was his boss. A man named Ethan Grant. The sound of the water in the lake seemed to stop. Ethan was stunned, his mind blank. He looked down at his hands, the hands that once trembled holding a wine glass, now trembling with guilt. The wind gently rustled the trees around the lake, but he heard nothing but the heavy beat of his own heart. His entire world collapsed in silence. It was no longer a coincidence, no longer an anonymous transaction. He was the one who had put pen to paper, the one who had ordered to cut all unnecessary barriers. He was the one who had destroyed her father, and then, by a bitter irony, was saved by his own daughter. Elena turned, her gaze calm but profound. Now, do you understand why I left that world? She said, her voice steady but cold. I couldn't continue to be part of a game where human dignity was just a number to negotiate. Leo stirred in his sleep, his head still resting on her shoulder. The boy knew nothing of the storm swirling in his father's mind beside them. Ethan looked at Elena, then at his son, overwhelmed by a shame he had never known. The numbers, the contracts, the victories, they all became small and meaningless. He bowed his head, his hands clenched, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to justify himself. The last rays of the afternoon sun fell upon the lake, reflecting a look of exhaustion and brokenness on his face. In that moment, Ethan Grant, the man who once dominated a whole financial world, was just a man defeated by the truth, a truth exposed not by hatred, but by the honesty and pain of the person he had once scorned. Ethan sat motionless on the bench, his ears ringing. Elena's words were like hammer blows straight to his conscience. He didn't hear the children laughing, didn't feel the evening breeze caressing him. Everything faded, leaving only his own distraught face reflected in her serene eyes. The final signature was Ethan Grant's. Leo stirred, let out a small yawn, and rubbed his eyes. The boy woke up in a silence so heavy it could be touched. He looked confusedly at his father's pale face and Elena's distant eyes. "What's wrong?" The innocent question broke the spell, pulling Ethan back to reality. He looked at his son, then at the woman gently holding him. He understood that he couldn't let this truth remain in the shadows. An apology was not enough. He had to atone with action, starting from this very moment. He stood up, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Elena, I won't justify myself. There is no excuse for what I did." He bent down, speaking softly to his son. "Leo, say goodbye to Miss Elena. Let's go home, son." The car drove in silence. Leo sensed the heaviness and dared not ask. But instead of turning toward the luxurious mansion, Ethan drove to the Grant Capital office. The hallway was deserted, the lights reflecting in his tired eyes. He led Leo by the hand down the long corridor into his office. He turned on a cartoon for his son, then closed the door, walking alone into the archive room. The smell of old paper and damp dust wafted out when he opened the filing cabinet. His hand trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents, until the title, Acquisition Vance Manufacturing, appeared. He carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and read everything again. Emails, minutes, memos, every line he had signed. But this time, he read not with the eyes of a businessman, but of a sinner reviewing his own sentence. Each page turned was a knife cutting deep into his memory. He clearly saw the ignored warnings, the humane options dismissed, and finally, his own cold signature on the last page. When he finished reading, it was dark. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled, but to him, it was all just a void with no way out. The next day, Ethan sought out Elena, not at a luxurious restaurant, but at her small bookstore after closing hours. The glass door reflected his silhouette, no longer the powerful man, but someone learning how to stand tall after a fall. She opened the door, seeing him standing there, damp with mist, holding a folder. Inside, the soft yellow light illuminated the old bookshelves. He didn't sit, only stood in the quiet room. "I read everything again," he said, his voice deep and hoarse. "I saw what I did, the choices I had, and the things I overlooked." He looked up at her, his eyes devoid of any arrogance, only rawness and exhaustion. "I used to think power made me strong, but in reality, it made me hollow. It made me a person my own son couldn't even understand." He placed the folder on the counter. "I can't change the past, but I will make it right. Even if it takes the rest of my life." Elena was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "True strength doesn't lie in defeating others, but in daring to look at yourself. If you truly want to make amends, start where you destroyed." Her words were like a mission given. And Ethan began. There were no press conferences, no newspaper articles. Everything happened quietly. He cancelled shady deals, restructured pharmaceutical contracts, choosing a less profitable but cleaner path. He established a retirement fund for the former Vance manufacturing workers, contacting them one by one. The day he arrived at the old factory, the broken sign was covered in dust. The former workers hesitated when they saw him step out of the car. Some turned away, others stared in disbelief. Ethan walked over, set his suit jacket aside, and said softly, "I didn't come to apologize. I came to work." He took a hammer, helping them put the old sign back up. The hands that once signed billion-dollar contracts were now stained with dust and grease. Sweat fell, mixing with the new paint on the sign, "Vance Workshop, rebuilt with honor." When the sign was rehung, the oldest worker gave a slight nod, saying nothing, just patting his shoulder. To Ethan, that was the greatest forgiveness he had ever received. He changed his life habits, coming home earlier, spending more time with Leo, taking him to the park, teaching him to play ball, listening to his stories from school. He still visited the bookstore, not to seek forgiveness, but so his son could be near the woman who made him feel safe. One afternoon, when he came to pick up Leo, he saw him sitting with Eleanor at a small table, both folding paper cranes. The sunset light streamed through the window, bathing them in a warm yellow glow. Leo smiled brightly, and Elena smiled back. Ethan stood at the doorway, quietly observing. He didn't want to break the moment. In his eyes, seeing his son's smile and Elena's peace, something within him was healed. For the first time in many years, Ethan Grant smiled. Not the smile of a winner, but of a man learning how to be human. He knew the road to atonement was still long, but at least he had started walking with dust-stained hands and with a heart that had learned to humble itself for the first time. The afternoons at the bookstore gradually became the most peaceful part of Ethan and Leo's day. The scent of old paper, the golden light, the whispering of pages, and Eleanor's gentle smile were like a warm blanket, covering the sharp edges of the small family. The paper crane was no longer the red wine stain of memory, but a gentle sign of hope. What was broken could be mended, with patience and hands that knew how to cherish. On a Friday afternoon, after a walk in the park and 2 ice cream cones, the 3 stopped at the bookstore for Leo to say goodbye to Elena before heading home. The boy gave her a yellow paper crane. "This is to bring you sunshine." Elena smiled, placed it on the windowsill, and thanked him in her slow, warm voice. As Ethan and Leo walked out, the boy turned back to wave through the glass. A complete and tranquil picture. 2 hours later, the tranquility shattered. Ethan was on a conference call when Maria rushed in, her face pale. "Mr. Grant, Leo, he hasn't come home." The piano lesson was only a few blocks from the house, a familiar route, and there were people on the street at that hour. Leo should have been home half an hour ago. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. He called the teacher. Leo left class on time. He just needed to cross the small road to get home, nowhere to be found. Panic surged. He called the police, called the security team, then drove out himself, running along the route Leo usually took, calling his son's name until his voice was hoarse. His phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. Only one line. "Now you know what it feels like to lose everything. No ransom demand, no proposal, just a statement." Ethan went numb. This wasn't a negotiation, but a voice erupting from an old wound. Angry faces flashed through his mind, fired employees, overwhelmed partners, those left behind. But a single line of text couldn't just be anonymous hatred. It smelled of the experience of loss, specific, personal, and persistent. News of Leo's disappearance spread quickly. Camera lights crowded the gate, the whispers like a sharp wind. Police entered the house, asking calm questions, marking the time, reconstructing the route. No one had a clue. Amidst the chaos, Elena arrived. She walked in without a sound. Ethan opened the door, a completely different man in her eyes, exposed and desperate. I'm sorry," he said, not knowing what he was apologizing for. "This is my fault." Elena didn't offer empty comfort. She placed a hand on his arm, her voice slow and steady. "We need to be clear-headed now. Show me the message." They looked at the cold line of text again. "No money demanded," Elena said, her eyes moving from the phone to the files Ethan was holding. "So he wants you to hurt. Wants you to listen. If he wants to be heard, he will choose someone with a story to tell." She paused. "Someone who lost everything because of you." They turned the living room into a war room. Ethan pulled out the list of controversial deals, the severe cuts he had signed, the names that had filed complaints. Elena opened her laptop, searching old articles, former workers' community groups, small forums that the press rarely visited. She read slowly, noting every sentence, comparing the language patterns, those who used phrases similar to the message, those who spoke of losing everything in a way that wasn't a slogan. One name appeared repeatedly during the final years of Vance and a few other projects: John Miller. Former factory foreman who led petitions to save the production line, who wrote dozens of unanswered letters. After the factory closed, his wife fell gravely ill. Insurance denied part of the cost. She passed away shortly after. In a few old posts, he said he had nothing left but an old truck and a relative's house to stay in. The words in his final posts were not threatening, but thick with the resentment of a father. Will anyone ever listen to us, even once? Eleanor circled a few sentences with a pen, pointing to the phrases identical to the message sent to Ethan. He didn't write to threaten. He wrote to force the person who caused the trouble to listen. If he approached Leo today, it's highly likely it wasn't to harm the boy. He wants to create a situation to force you into a dialogue. He wants you to feel the fear he once felt when he lost his loved one. She spoke slowly, as if thinking and choosing her words at the same time, to leave room for hope. Ethan thought of Leo walking between two rows of trees, of a grey-haired man hesitating at the street corner, calling him over, saying, "Your dad is waiting by the parking lot," or simply asking to walk with me for a bit. I need to give this to your dad. No dragging, no struggling, just a word heavy as stone. A confused, powerless adult, setting up a terrible game, hoping to drag his opponent to the negotiation table one last time. Police continued to check cameras around the area. The pieces gradually came together. Leo left class on time. A shadow of a man in a cap stood a distance away, not touching Leo, just walking beside him, talking. Then both turned onto the less-traveled street leading to the main road. No rush, no aggressive moves, just a decision crossing a line, and then everything slipping away like rain on glass. "Elena," Ethan whispered, his voice tight, "if it is him, if he just wants me to listen." "Then we still have time," she replied. "Someone who wants to be heard usually wants to speak in a quiet place. He will choose a place that once held meaning for him." Ethan looked up at the black and white photo hanging in the room. The old factory gate before demolition day, the sign tilted, a few people standing silently. Eleanor looked too, understanding the same thought that had just emerged. They passed on the locations linked to Miller to the investigation team, the old workers' housing complex, the small church where his wife's memorial service was held, the roadside diner that used to be the night shift gathering spot, and a wooden cabin by a lake, owned by his relatives, mentioned in a comment years ago. Outside, the rain began to fall. A long drop of water slid down the window pane, leisurely, like a thread. It rolled past the yellow paper crane Leo had given Elena that day, softening the paper, the edge of the wing slightly drooping. Elena gently held the crane, smoothing it out. "Wet paper tears easily," she whispered, as if reminding herself to handle hope gently. In the softly lit room, no one spoke of punishment. They spoke of a way back, of how to call a father back from the brink that Ethan himself had once pushed others toward. And when the police lights from the street outside swept across the curtains, only the quiet blue and red lights glided across the wall, not loudly, not disrupting, as a reminder that even in the midst of a storm, one can slow down to truly listen to one another. Ethan's living room had been transformed into a war room. Outside, police and media created a chaotic mess. Inside, there was only a terrifying silence of concentration. Ethan and Elena worked side by side, their synergy stemming from a single shared goal, to bring Leo home. He mentioned losing everything, Elena said, her eyes never leaving the laptop screen. That suggests a specific event, a total loss, not just a job. Ethan nodded, searching his painful memory. Project Phoenix, about 2 years ago. We shut down a small manufacturing plant in the suburbs. A lot of people lost their jobs, and their retirement fund was also severely impacted. Many families had to sell their homes. Elena quickly typed on the keyboard. She accessed old articles, worker forums. "There's a lot of anger here," she murmured. "But one name keeps coming up. A man named John Miller, former foreman. He organized the protests. It seems he didn't just lose his job. His wife also fell seriously ill afterward and passed away. He blamed Grant Capital for everything." Ethan's heart clenched. John Miller. He vaguely remembered a man who always stood at the forefront of the protests, his face etched with hardship and full of resentment. "Check Miller's financial records," Ethan said. "Are there any unusual activities?" Eleanor, with her skills, quickly accessed public databases. "Nothing major, but there's something odd. He just sold his old truck a week ago. Cash transaction." She paused, frowning. "And he has a cousin who owns a small wooden cabin near Black Creek Lake, about 2 hours' drive from here. The cabin has been vacant for a long time." That was the clue they needed. Ethan immediately relayed the information to the police captain in charge of the case. He couldn't just sit there and wait. "I'm going there," he stated decisively. "I'm coming with you," Elena replied, without a moment's hesitation. They drove in silence, through the pouring rain and the dark night. This wasn't an action movie rescue. The police force had been notified and were on their way. But Ethan needed to be there. He needed to face the consequences of his own making. As they approached the Black Creek Lake area, they saw the small wooden cabin nestled behind the trees. A faint light flickered from the window. The police had instructed them to maintain a safe distance. But through the binoculars, Ethan could see the shadow of a man pacing inside. And then, in one moment, he saw a smaller figure. Leo. His heart seemed to break. The police plan was to approach quietly, but before they could act, John Miller seemed to sense something. He pulled Leo out onto the porch, his hand gripping the boy's shoulder tightly. "Grant!" he yelled into the night. "I know you're out there. Come out!" Ethan didn't think. He got out of the car, walking toward the light. "Miller, let the boy go," he said, his voice trembling but trying to remain calm. "This is between you and me." "Between us?" Miller laughed bitterly. "You don't even remember my name, do you? You just sit in your tower and sign papers, ruining the lives of hundreds of people. My wife died because we couldn't afford treatment, Grant. Your son is just experiencing a little of the fear my family had to endure." Leo started crying. "Dad!" "John!" Elena suddenly spoke up. She had stepped to stand beside Ethan. Her voice held no fear, only empathy. "I understand your pain. I also lost my father because of decisions like that." Miller froze when he heard a woman's voice. Elena's appearance disrupted his script of revenge. "His son has no fault in this," Elena continued. "Hurting a child won't bring your wife back. It will only turn you into the kind of person you hate." Her words were like an antidote. The resentment in Miller's eyes was gradually replaced by despair and sorrow. He looked down at Leo, then back at Ethan and Eleanor. The hand gripping the boy's shoulder slowly loosened. Just then, the police rushed in. They subdued Miller quickly. He didn't resist, just knelt on the ground and burst into tears. Ethan rushed to hug Leo, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, son," he whispered. He turned back, seeing Miller being handcuffed. A primal surge of fury rose in him. He wanted to rush in and hit the man who had terrified his son, but Elena held his arm. "Don't," she said softly. "You've caused enough pain. Don't repeat it." Ethan stopped. He looked at Miller, now just a broken man. He no longer saw a monster, but another victim of his own cruelty. He turned back to Elena. She hadn't just saved his life twice. She was saving his soul. 6 months passed since the terrifying night at Black Creek Lake. Autumn had given way to winter, and the first snow was falling lightly outside Ethan Grant's office window. His workspace had changed. The complex financial charts were still there, but interspersed were framed, carefully preserved, messy drawings by Leo. On the corner of his desk, next to the expensive phone, was a yellow paper crane, slightly worn with time. It was his moral compass, a constant reminder of what truly mattered. Ethan's journey of atonement was not a media event, but a series of quiet actions. He was present at John Miller's trial, not to accuse, but to listen and understand. He established the Rebirth Fund and ensured that every former Vance manufacturing worker received the support they deserved. He transformed Grant Capital from a predatory machine into a more responsible organization, even if it meant losing some old allies and a portion of the profit. Through the opaque glass, Elena saw the figure of the man lying on the bed next to Diego, his face hidden by a surgical mask, yet those trembling hands she recognized immediately. Leonardo Vega. Outside, the rain began to fall again. Water streamed down the glass, merging with the weakening heartbeat on the monitor. Elena stood silently, no longer angry, only feeling her heart heavy. Finally, perhaps all debts had been paid, not with money, not with fame, but with a life and a belated word of gratitude. When she received the call from the hospital, Elena nearly dropped her phone. She rushed out of the Vega Group building, leaving Leonardo amidst the crowd and the camera flashes of the press. All the hatred, all the anger she had accumulated, vanished. At that moment, she was no longer the humiliated woman or the witness to justice. She was only a sister racing against time to save her little brother. Diego was rushed into the emergency room upon arrival. The hereditary blood disease had reached a critical stage. The doctor's words were gentle, but like a thunderclap. If we don't perform a bone marrow transplant within the next 48 hours, we fear we won't be able to save him. Elena slumped into a chair, her hands tightly clasped, her lips trembling, and unable to speak. In her mind, there was only one sound, Diego's heartbeat when he was little, and her old promise, "I won't let you lose a mother again." A few days after resigning as CEO, Leonardo lived in silence. The Vega Group was handed over to a transition committee, while he began overseeing the operations of the Morales Foundation, the charity fund named after his former benefactors. People said he was making amends, but Leonardo himself knew it wasn't penance. It was a different way of life, where he forced himself to see real faces, real hands, every day. When he heard the news of Diego's critical condition, he didn't think. He just went. He appeared at the hospital, in an old shirt, his face gaunt. No bodyguards, no reporters, nothing left of the Vega Group, only the naked man trying to fix the impossible. Eleanor saw him, her eyes tired but still firm. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. You've done enough. This battle is over." Leonardo stopped, his voice low and calm. "That boy deserves to live, Elena. And I have a responsibility to him, more than you realize." He didn't look into her eyes when he spoke, but Elena heard something different in his voice, no longer the scent of power, only the sincerity of a man who had surrendered to his own conscience. That afternoon, Clara came to the hospital with a folder of medical records. She was in charge of managing the Morales Fund, so she was informed about the search for a compatible bone marrow donor. When she saw the results, she froze. The words at the top of the paper slowed her heart rate. She went looking for Leonardo, but when she found him in the empty hallway, she stopped halfway. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. She didn't say anything. She just slowly placed her hand on his, and that was enough. The following spring, there was no lavish wedding or sensational headlines. There was only a small ceremony in the backyard garden. Leo was the ring bearer. Frank Kowalski and a few former Vance manufacturing workers were also present, not as former enemies, but as new friends. The large house was no longer cold. It was filled with laughter, the smell of baked goods, and stacks of books placed everywhere. Occasionally, in quiet moments, Ethan would watch Elena read to Leo, and he would remember all that had happened. The scar was still there, but it no longer ached. It was a part of their story, a reminder that even from the most painful ashes, a true home could still be built with hope, forgiveness, and love. Thus, the journey of Ethan, Eleanor, and the boy Leo reached a peaceful harbor. Their story did not begin with love, but with an insult, a wine stain, and a painful past. But perhaps the most difficult beginnings often lead to the most enduring paths. Ethan began as a king in his proud castle, but he only truly found wealth when he learned to step down, listen, and admit he was wrong. He learned that true strength is not about never falling, but about having the courage to stand up and rebuild from the very fragments he had caused. As for Elena, she showed us something even stronger than forgiveness: compassion. She didn't save Ethan because he deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. She didn't use the past as a weapon for revenge, but as a lesson to live a more meaningful life. She taught us that, sometimes, the best way to heal our own wounds is to help others bind theirs. Ultimately, this story is a reminder that none of us are perfect. We can all make mistakes, be blinded by arrogance, and hurt others. But what matters is not where we stumbled, but what we choose to do afterward. Will we continue to drown in the emptiness of power, or will we seek genuine connection, just as the smile of a child illuminated the path for Ethan? Thank you for joining us through every chapter of this story. We hope that the emotions and lessons from Ethan and Elena have touched you in some way. Each of our lives is also a story with many unexpected chapters. We hope you will always keep kindness in your heart and find the strength to write the next chapters meaningfully. Take good care of yourself, and we hope to meet you again in the stories to come.